I'm Emily Cheng in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up the next hour, Trump defiant. The president says he is at zero risk of being removed from office by the 25th Amendment. Meantime, lawmakers are considering impeaching him for the second time. We will have the very latest from Washington. Plus, Twitter Purge, the social network, deletes more than 70,000 accounts tied to QAnon, days after banning the president for good. We're going to talk to Tristan Harris of the Center for Humane Technology, also the star of the Netflix hit, The Social Dilemma. And tracking mutations, the high-stakes work to reveal COVID mutations by the biotech firm Illumina may be truly illuminating indeed. We're going to talk to the CEO about just how dangerous the new strain is. All of that in a moment, but first, talking about the markets, U.S. stocks moving higher as investors mulled the prospects of an economic recovery and the rollout of the vaccines. I want to get the full picture with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Ed, walk us through the day.
Yeah, choppy trading in U.S. equity markets, swinging between gains and losses, but we ended the day in the green across all major U.S. indices. If there was one area of underperformance, it was technology stocks, Emily. The Nasdaq 100 a little softer, off by around 0.1%. But if you look at some of the points movers, Microsoft really dragging that index down, along with Comcast and Google. There were some gains, notably in Intel, that's having a good day on the back of some announcements at CES, the conference that's going on virtually, as you know, Emily. And speaking of semiconductors, how often have we had this conversation? The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, or SOX, up by around 0.6%, continuing its outperformance above the S&P 500 and other equity markets. And again, a real focus today on small caps. The Russell 2000 index up by 1.8%, another fresh record high for that index as investors put money into small caps. The NYSE FANG Plus index, that basket of big technology stocks, it was up by 0.8%, but only 3 names in there actually in positive territory. Very dependent on 2 big movers, Emily. Tesla up by 4.7% and Baidu up around 9%. Lots of energy behind EV stocks still. Lots of energy behind that Tesla story. And now we see new names. Bloomberg News scoops this week about different names, including Lucid Motors, looking at SPACs, looking at accessing the public markets. But again, the market's pretty sanguine about all the things that are going on. But we are in the depths of a pandemic. Lots of focus, as you say, Emily, on a vaccine, and lots of focus about why we're hitting fresh record highs and having equity froth when there's so much going on in the world.
Right. So much focus, Ed, still also on what is happening in Washington and what's happening with Facebook and Twitter after they banned the president. Facebook indefinitely, Twitter permanently. Both companies' shares continue to fall today. What's driving that?
Yeah, pressure continuing on social media stocks. Facebook down by around 2.2%, third straight day of declines. Twitter down by 2.4%, sixth straight day of declines. That's the worst streak for Twitter in 2 years. And the change now is that Wall Street and analysts are looking more closely at what Twitter's decision to remove President Trump from the platform means in terms of its overall business. One analyst at Rosenblatt Securities suggesting that it could result in a decrease of 6 to 9 million U.S. monthly and daily active users in full year 2021. So an effect on its business from that decision. But not so with Snap, up 3.6%, rising for a 4th straight session. It seems immune from some of the pressures that other social media stocks have been under. One reason, a lot of focus and optimism around advertising when it comes to Snap. The president speaking today, as you know, Emily, no direct rebuke of social media companies, but the President Trump saying that free speech is under assault.
Right. And of course, Republican lawmakers, some of them have said they're going to focus on banning Section 230 for good. Our Ed Ludlow, thank you so much for that update. As Ed mentioned, President Trump saying he's at zero risk of being removed from office after encouraging supporters who went on to attack the U.S. Capitol last week. But he suggested President-elect Joe Biden could be. Trump didn't elaborate on how this might be used against Biden, but let's discuss. We're joined now by Jeannie Sean Zaino of Bloomberg Opinion and a professor of political science at Iona College. Jeannie, thank you so much for joining us. We're getting new reporting from the New York Times that Republican leader Mitch McConnell has actually said he's pleased the Democrats are moving to impeach the president and that he believes the president did commit impeachable offenses. What do you make of this report?
Yeah, fascinating report, as you mentioned, out of the New York Times just moments ago, that Mitch McConnell has privately, as you said, told people that he believes the president committed an impeachable offense. And, of course, we saw his wife resign her cabinet position a few days ago in response to what happened. And, of course, Mitch McConnell, let's not forget, also lost his majority leadership in the Senate, something that we also understand he blames President Trump for. So I am not surprised that he believes the president committed an impeachable offense. We also heard he discussed with Joe Biden whether there was a prospect of the Senate both holding an impeachment trial and looking at and confirming his nominees as he takes office. We haven't heard back as to whether that, in fact, would be possible. But I believe that Mitch McConnell sees this as a way to, as he said, purge the president from the party. And this is somebody who, even before all that happened on Wednesday, said he didn't go along with his colleagues on the Republican side who were trying to decertify the election, if you will.
Now, we actually do have a quote from the president speaking at the border earlier today. Let's take a listen to part of what he had to say.
Before we begin, I'd like to say that free speech is under assault like never before. The 25th Amendment is of zero risk to me, but will come back to haunt Joe Biden and the Biden administration. As the expression goes, be careful what you wish for.
Jeannie, what's your reaction to that?
Well, of course, the president is reported to be furious that he was kicked off of the social media platforms, and he has made that clear in his first remarks since Wednesday. As you and Ed were talking about, saying that that free speech is under assault. He, of course, has called a long time for the revocation of Section 230, and, of course, we may see some of that as we get into the new Congress coming from the Democratic side. It was very odd to hear him talk about the fact that he is not, going to be subject to the 25th Amendment. We also heard reports that he may have spoken with Mike Pence for the first time last night. Those seem to be unconfirmed. So maybe he understands that Mike Pence is not going to invoke that, as the Democrats would like him to, and a veiled threat to the Biden administration that Joe Biden could be subject to that. As you mentioned, I'm not sure how, but it seemed to be a veiled threat, which leaves us in a position where Democrats will vote on this resolution for the 25th Amendment. It is, not going to happen as far as we know. And then they will move tomorrow and probably tomorrow evening on a vote on this one article of impeachment, which, as we were just discussing, apparently has this, at least some support from Mitch McConnell, and potentially we're also hearing maybe we will see some support from on the Republican side, maybe as much as a handful of Republicans in the House or more who may support it.
Does this reporting from the New York Times that Mitch McConnell supports the Democrats moving forward with impeachment, does that change anything? What do you expect the last few days leading up to January 20th will actually look like?
I think we will get a vote out of the House, and I think, again, we'll have a few, at least a handful of Republicans go along with the impeachment vote. It will move to the Senate. We still don't have a sign as to when they will take it up. At this point, it looks to be after January 20th. And we still don't know if there will be enough Republicans in the Senate to support a conviction. Of course, he will have left office by then, but there's a discussion as to whether you can hold a trial after somebody leaves office. Some people think you can, and so we may see that. But I am not convinced we'll see enough Republicans go along with that in the trial. But we will probably see that trial go forward.
And Jeannie, what do you think the president will do next? I mean, do you see him starting his own social network, a broadcast network, and can he do that without at least some sort of institutional Republican support?
Very, very tough for him to do. And as you mentioned, institutional Republican support, also, of course, support from banks, Deutsche Bank moving away from him, Signature Bank and others. Very, very tough for him to do. He's incredibly isolated at this point. Now, obviously, things can change, but this is a man who will leave office facing significant legal jeopardy, at least at the state level, if not the federal level. And again, we may need to look for a pardon in the coming days. So he's got, legal jeopardy. He's also got financial jeopardy. He owes a good deal of money, and it doesn't look like he's got institutional support at this point, in my view, to do what I think he could have done prior to Wednesday, which is to start, as you mentioned, a social media platform or some other media platform. I think that's increasingly tough for him at this point. I can't imagine he could do it at least immediately. I think he is going to have to lay low and address his financial and his legal challenges that he's going to face on January 21st.
All right. Well, appreciate you trying to map out the next few days for us. Still a lot of uncertainty. And of course, we'll be watching what happens in Washington. Jeannie Shangeno, Bloomberg Politics contributor, also the author of American Democracy in Crisis. Thanks so much for stopping by. Okay, coming up, Twitter has purged tens of thousands of QAnon accounts in the wake of a deadly riot, at the U.S. Capitol. Stick with us for more of that conversation. This is Bloomberg. Twitter has permanently suspended more than 70,000 accounts dedicated to sharing QAnon-associated content. This is the latest example of a major tech platform ratcheting up enforcement in the wake of that deadly riot in Washington last week. Joining us now, Kurt Wagner, who covers Facebook and Twitter for us. Kurt, what is the significance of these QAnon accounts getting banned? I mean, we know that Facebook and Twitter have been trying to ban more accounts like this, but this seems like a sizable number.
It is. 70,000 is, that's a lot of people, right, or a lot of accounts. And I think really this comes back to what happened last week at the Capitol. Obviously, there were a number of protesters that were linked to QAnon. There was a lot of discussion online linked to QAnon in the protest or the riot. And so I think this is really Twitter trying to protect itself, really, and protect this from happening again. There's obviously been discussion that there could be more riots at the inauguration or in D.C. in the weeks leading up to the inauguration. So I really think this is just an extension of things that had happened last week. And as you pointed out, both Facebook and Twitter have already said QAnon shouldn't really be allowed on their platforms. So this is furthering those policies.
Twitter shares have been down now 2 days in a row. Obviously, their most popular user is gone. A lot of people certainly followed President Trump. But, why do you think that is?
Well, it's funny because we were looking into whether Twitter's business might be hurt by the end of President Trump's term, right? Like, is the fact that he's no longer president going to hurt business? And at the time, the feeling was no, that he would still be on Twitter. At the very least, he would still be kind of opining, and people might slowly drift back into other topics that really matter to them. But that didn't really take into account this idea that Trump would be off Twitter entirely. And I think the fact that he is now gone, and there is a speculation that a lot of his followers might follow him to like a Parler or a Gab or somewhere else, is probably spooking some investors who might see that, perhaps engagement would go down, user growth would go down without Trump on the service anymore. So we don't really know if that's going to be the case. My guess, though, is that people are just reacting to this and trying to figure out, could this hurt Twitter's business in the long haul?
Speaking of Parler, how easy will it be for Parler to find another web hosting platform now that Amazon Web Services have cut them off in this environment? Are they going to be able to do that?
Well, I think the delay kind of tells you everything, right? I mean, the fact that they haven't found anyone yet, that the site is still down. I was just checking right before we got on. I mean, that to me is quite telling that they're having difficulty doing this. I don't think that it will disappear forever. I think that there's always corners of the internet where there is someone willing to kind of host and play host to these kinds of discussions. But we have never seen a coordinated kind of pushback like this from tech companies before either. And so this is very unique. It's very unprecedented. And the fact that we're now coming up on multiple days where they haven't had the service up and running, I think is quite telling that they're having a tougher time than maybe we all even expected.
Now, how would the president go about starting a new social network if he wanted to?
Oh, my gosh. I mean, this is a really interesting question because the thing that makes these social networks so valuable is that everyone's already there, right? When you go to Facebook, the reason you maybe hold on to your Facebook account is you have colleagues and college friends and family, right? Like it's a communal gathering place in a way. And that's just hard to build from scratch. That's why we've never really seen a competitor to Facebook up until this point, right? It's that network. So Trump is certainly stronger than most in terms of having a following. And if he shows up somewhere, people will go there. But the question is, are they just going to be there to hear him, or is there going to be more of a community around that? And that's the kind of thing that I think is really tough to replicate, that Facebook and Twitter and others, have a clear, distinct advantage on.
And will they just be talking to themselves? All right, Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner. Kurt, thank you very much for your reporting. We'll continue to follow. Okay, coming up, the new COVID-19 strain continues to surface in countries around the world, and in the United States. We're going to speak to the CEO of Illumina, a company that's helping to identify cases of the new variant here in America. That is next. This is Bloomberg. The new strain of COVID-19 has affected many more people in the UK than the outbreak last year. In Ontario, Canada, the government declared a second provincial emergency as cases accelerate and a new, more transmissible variant has been identified. Joining us now to discuss, Francis D'Souza, CEO of Illumina. The company has found 51 cases of the virus mutation in the United States. So, Francis, obviously 51 is a lot, and we can assume that there are a lot more. What traits are you seeing in the new variant? How much more transmissible or dangerous is it?
You're absolutely right, Emily, that, we found 51 cases here, but it's clear there are a lot more of those cases here in the U.S. It is a more transmissible variant of the virus. And the thing we need to do here in the U.S. is just a lot more surveillance so that we can identify both how many cases of the B117 virus there are, but also new strains as they're emerging. We're seeing a new strain that's called the South African strain, so it's B1351. And although it's been identified in the UK, we still haven't identified it here in the US.
Now, your work involves genetic sequencing, and I wonder, it has been suggested that the United States especially is dangerously blind to these new COVID mutations, that we need, a nationwide system that involves genetic sequencing, genetic testing in order to identify and fight this. I mean, at this point, is something like that realistic? I mean, how can we get a handle on it?
Yeah, one of the things that's become absolutely clear over the last year, Emily, is that we do need, as a global community, to set up a global genomics-based pathogen surveillance system. It's clear that to identify if an outbreak is happening and then to identify the source of that outbreak, we need to be surveilling our environment. And then we need to identify how this virus is transmitting and mutating as it moves around geographically. And that's true whether it's a coronavirus outbreak like we're dealing with right now, but it's also true for things like antimicrobial resistance or bioterrorist attacks. And so what we need is to set up this network, this surveillance system that's looking in our environment to see what pathogens are emerging and then how they're moving around. That's important not just to know what's happening, but also to drive policy decisions like, should we be shutting down travel to certain regions? All that needs to be informed by data coming out of this surveillance system. We didn't have any, and we need to put one together.
And, at this point, then how do you see the pandemic continuing to unfold? I wonder if we're going to be sort of living with this kind of tracking and greater awareness of, the dangers and viruses in the world around us forever.
Yeah, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to put together as quickly as we can the surveillance capacity we need to try and deal with the current pandemic. And so, you have, for example, the UK leading the way in terms of doing large-scale sequencing and genomic surveillance to understand how the virus is mutating in the UK environment. You're seeing the government of Australia committed to a national system for COVID surveillance. And, we're ramping up capacity here in the U.S. more slowly. So we'll put together the surveillance we need right now to get us through this pandemic. But to your point, this is going to have to become part of a national infrastructure and part of a global community where we share this data so that we can watch for either the reemergence of this coronavirus or, future pathogens.
Now, your work involves cancer treatment, reproductive health, agriculture. Where do you expect we're going to see the biggest breakthroughs with the help of sequencing technology in the short term? We've got about a minute left.
Yeah, there are a few areas I think will play a big role. One, genomics is going to play an essential role in dealing with this pandemic. One, in terms of surveillance, but two, you're seeing the emergence of genomic-driven vaccines like the mRNA vaccines from Moderna or Pfizer-BioNTech. And so you'll see genomic-driven medicines, therapies, vaccines emerge, partially accelerated by the pandemic. You'll also see big impacts in cancer treatment. We're seeing the emergence of these precision oncology therapies and using genomics to match cancer patients to the right therapy that'll be most effective for them. And then in the middle of this year, a company called Grail that we're in the midst of acquiring is going to launch the world's first blood test to identify early-stage cancer across 50 types of cancer. That's truly going to be groundbreaking.
We will continue to follow all of this groundbreaking work. Illumina CEO Francis D'Souza, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And coming up, Tristan Harris, star of Netflix's film The Social Dilemma, who also runs the Center for Humane Technology, joins us to share his take on social media booting the president days before the end of his presidency. That is next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. President Trump's account has been deleted from Twitter permanently and from Facebook indefinitely. But almost a week after those violent riots in Washington, D.C., the FBI is bracing for more potential violence at state capitals across the country before Inauguration Day. Tristan Harris, the star of Netflix's hit documentary, The Social Dilemma, and co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology, is calling for people to wake up from the digital spell that's been cast by the social network to avoid more disasters like this in the future. Tristan is with me now. Thank you so much, Tristan, for taking the time to join us. Obviously, you've been talking about this for years, and now this is at the very epicenter of a global conversation. What is your take on the social networks banning the president? Was this the right move, or was this too late?
Emily, this is a really hard place to be in. I think the main thing that The Social Dilemma was trying to communicate as a film is that it's not just that there's individual accounts that can incite violence, but that this business model for the last 10 years, by being incentivized to put each of us into a narrower and narrower channel of reality that is incompatible with others, that is sort of a cult factory. It produces these self-reinforcing cults. We just saw that on display on January 6th. And in the film, Tim Kendall, another guest that we've had on here together with you, said in the film that the short term, what he's worried about is civil war. And when the film came out, I think a lot of people thought that was too extreme a statement to make. And I think we're seeing that escalation as being the natural progression of this business model that incites violence, not just about individual actors like Trump. And so now we're in this difficult position where, I think we have autocrats, a handful of tech CEOs who can make unilateral, non-democratic decisions about essentially digital impeachment. You can digitally impeach the president, and you just have to get, employees at those companies to believe and put pressure on the tech CEOs, and they will make that choice, and that's what's happened. But I think those who are rightly concerned about that need to ask the alternative of simply allowing this machine to continue without any kind of digital articles of impeachment, that there are conditions in which people violate norms or incite violence, and we are lacking those. And I think, if anything, what this moment calls for is almost a constitutional convention for the digital world, so that people do not see this as a moment in which this is a power grab by one political party over the other, and instead see this as the moment in which we come to terms with the fact that we need a digital constitution for how to deal with this, this new situation.
Would you say that we're on the brink of civil war, or are we already in the middle of a civil war? Is there a digital civil war being waged online right now that exploded at the Capitol?
You know, Emily, I want to be really careful about the saying, I think, in race car driving, where you don't put your attention on where you don't want to go. And so I don't think that we need to talk in terms of, you know, this is meant to be a warning, right? I think you can make the argument that we have, this is a moment of escalation and conflict, right? The deplatforming of what 71 million people view as the elector that they voted for is a very significant act, which is, again, why I think we need to come together to say, what is the Constitution? What are the articles of impeachment for the digital world? Because one of the things is that, as I said in my Senate testimony 2 years ago, when software eats the world, as Mark Andreessen said, what that really means is that private interests start eating up the public institutions. Just as I said, in Social Dilemma, when YouTube eats Saturday morning cartoons, we lose all the protections for Saturday morning. And now you have a private company governing what used to be a publicly interested part of the attention economy, which is children's television. When you have Facebook eat up election advertising, we deregulate election advertising. And we also lose the democratic procedures for what we want election advertising to be, what does it mean for it to be fair? And so when the private eats the public, it deregulates the public. We lose those protections, and we don't have democratic accountability. We don't have a kind of constitution for what do we want that new sphere to be. And so whether we're talking about digital impeachment and deplatforming people, or we're talking about what are the safe forms of virality, because I think we have to look at, is the viral-based business model where anyone can post anything and it can be spread to billions of people. That's a kind of exponential weapon. We've decoupled that power from responsibility. Meaning that I can say anything I want without accountability, and that's a broken system. We need some kind of constitutional convention to reconcile this.
Well, the folks who would disagree with the actions that Facebook and Twitter have taken would say you can't say anything, because look at what happened to President Trump's account. David Sachs, who's a longtime tech investor and entrepreneur, has been arguing very strongly against the decisions that Facebook and Twitter have made here. One of his tweets in response to someone pointing out that, look, these are private companies who can decide to do business or not do business with whoever they want. He said, if your views are preferred by tech oligarchs, you can instantly get distribution to millions. If not, you can stand in the street yelling like a lunatic. What do you think to the folks who are saying we're walking a dangerous line between free speech and censorship?
No, quite. Well, listen, I mean, I think we all know that there's no clean answer here for a free speech versus not free speech or censorship conversation. I think the distinction that Renee DiResta and I have been on for 2 years now, there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom to reach, meaning exponential audiences. Just like I can go to a kitchen store and buy a pair of knives, I don't have to do a background check or get an education or training about how to use knives, because the power is very limited. But when I get an AK-47, there's a background check, there's training, there's all sorts of things, because that's a more dangerous weapon. And I think the mistake is to call this speech as opposed to exponential reach. I think now we have to have a conversation about selective enforcement, because you can't have tech companies making a supposed standard, but then only enforcing it in some areas and not others, and not taking down Ayatollah Khomeini or something like that. But again, it's a false dichotomy between free speech versus censorship, as opposed to what are the rules that make up our digital sphere? What do we want our digital nation? Because this is a digital country now, right? That's essentially what's happened. We are a cyborg democracy. We are a democracy with a digital brain implant that is the Facebook brain implant. And as it's been plugged into our digital to social brain, it's driven us crazy. And we have to have some kind of democratic governance and safety protocols for making sure that that brain implant doesn't drive us all crazy, which is what it does.
What are your biggest fears, Tristan, right now? I mean, you point out it's not just about the president. He's got plenty of followers who are still on these platforms, and followers who are angry. What are you most afraid of at this moment about the social dilemma?
I mean, I'm simply afraid of this driving up even more polarization. So right now, to 71 million people in this country, it looks like a digital act of war has happened. And I worry about what response that will generate if it's not immediately pulled back into a democratic conversation. What is the way to govern the digital world that we're all participating in? We don't elect who works at Twitter or who has the executive ranks at Twitter or who's on the trusted safety teams at Twitter or Facebook for that matter. And we need to have some kind of democratic process. And then you get into conversations about the global process, because what would be democratically elected to govern the US political sphere is different than the Myanmar or the Germany political sphere, or Ethiopia, where Facebook is sort of spawning a second genocide over there now. So I think this is really just a need for accelerating this conversation about what do humane and democratic platforms that are going to become our digital habitats, our digital environments, what does it mean for them to serve the public interest? The one thing we do know is they can't have a business model based on manipulating our attention and putting us into our narrow cult factories that drive us crazy.
But assuming that the business model isn't going to change before Inauguration Day, what do you think happens in a post-Trump world? What do these social networks look like, and how do they change?
I think we're all finding this out, right? Many people have been talking for a long time about, deplatforming Trump, and people were wondering what would the consequences be. I don't think anyone has played out. It's a very complex system. It's led to, I think, much more polarization, monitoring, the left and the right's reaction to all of this. I worry about conflict. I worry about how do we actually not take an action that only drives up a heightened counter response. I think there's too much unilateral action that people think is going to solve the problem, but actually only drives up the level of escalation on the other side. And I'm looking at models for truth and reconciliation and things that can actually de-escalate. And that's, I think, what we need to be looking at. And I don't think anybody knows what exactly happens. I do know, again, with this business model, that unless we wake up from this 10-year trance that has warped our psyche and warped our collective psyche to be divided against itself, like a digital psychosis in which our minds are divided against its own self, we are not going to solve it. But I think the social dilemma is an incredible step for people to all be aware of, so we have a common ground about why we lost common ground.
All right. Well, Tristan, you've offered many possible social solutions, a digital constitution, a change in the business models. Always appreciate your very reasoned and thoughtful views here. Tristan Harris of the Center for Humane Technology, thank you so very much. Okay, coming up, how people get their news, by the way, is changing, putting a lot of power, as we have discussed, into the hands of technology. We're going to talk to one outlet, one new platform about the future of media next. This is Bloomberg. When it comes to news, accurate reporting has never been more important. However, with political passion sweeping the nation on all sides, many have looked to alternative means to get to the most up-to-date information. I am joined now by one of those outlets and platforms, the Substack founder and CEO, Chris Best. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. So I know a few prominent journalists who have left their respectful news organizations to start their own Substack, their own newsletter, their own audiences. Talk to us about what you have to offer readers and journalists at such a tumultuous time in the news business.
Yeah, so Substack is a subscription publishing platform for independent writers. And we're hearing a lot right now about how kind of the business model that pays for a lot of the things that we read online is one of the root causes of kind of the distorted information environment that we find ourselves in. And that's kind of the same reason we started Substack. We wanted to have an answer to the question, well, if you weren't going to have everything be paid for by sort of maximum attention and advertising, how could a better system work? And so what Substack is offering is an alternative business model where readers subscribe directly to writers they trust, and they pay them directly, which means that they are ultimately the customer. They sort of, hire and fire the writers that they trust. And it's kind of an alternate ecosystem to ad-supported social media as we know it.
And what kind of resources do you provide? You don't provide any editing or moderation or advice, right?
We do provide some advice, and we have a all-in-one software tool that makes it so that if you're just an independent, writer that's going off by yourself, you can use the tool, and it publishes to the web, it publishes to email, it takes subscriptions, it puts everything in the right format. It kind of makes that entire process really easy. Our ambition is, if you're a writer, we say, come and type into this box, and if the things you type into the box are good enough, you can kind of build your own media empire. So we provide all of that, and we have some additional services that layer on top of that. So we have some legal advice. We don't provide editors, but people can hire their own editors, and that often works really well.
Now, if you're raising journalistic voices and individual voices that aren't subject to the sort of same fact-checking and, sometimes bureaucracy and red tape that you find at a traditional news organization, are you at all concerned about leading to sort of increasing polarization at a time when our country is so polarized and fake news and misinformation and clickbait are so rampant?
We think about that stuff a lot, and we actually think that the Substack model helps make that a lot better, because on Substack, when I'm a writer, the thing I have to work towards is earning and keeping the trust of the people who are subscribing to me and paying me. And so I don't have an incentive to be kind of deliberately polarizing or deliberately provoking or kind of playing into the sort of outrage game. I have to convince my readers that I am a thoughtful person that's worth reading. And that difference in incentives leads to much better work.
You would think at a time like this that more readers might be flocking to authoritative news sources. We're in the middle of a potentially big transformation or big transition in how we get our news and what we actually want to see and read as President Trump presumably leaves office. I mean, he's, of course, and his tweets, which don't exist anymore, have driven a lot of the news cycle. So I wonder where you think the news industry and Substack's role in it, where is it going? How does the news business evolve over the next year?
I think a lot of people have lost faith in what they used to think of as authoritative news sources. And there are a lot of places that have been playing the same unfortunate game of kind of maximizing engagement, maximizing outrage, all of these things. And I think people are hungry for something different. They're hungry for something that they believe that they can trust, and they're increasingly don't know where to find that. And that places like Substack that let writers go independent and have their own platform, their own voice, is a very powerful solution to that.
What are the kind of popular rising trends on Substack, whether it's the most popular Substacks or most popular genres? For example, local news has been kind of dying a slow death. And I wonder, what are the voids you think Substack will fill?
There's a rich diversity of people on Substack and topics they're covering. There's all kinds of stuff. It tends to be people that have a point of view that people find interesting and want to hear more from. We are seeing a lot of politics. We're seeing, Heather Cox Richardson writes Letters from an American on Substack. The Dispatch is kind of a center-right independent. They're building a whole kind of media business on top of Substack, and aiming to sort of fill that void of kind of this trustworthy voice that helps you make sense of all the craziness that's going on is definitely something we see a lot of demand for right now.
All right, well, we'll continue to follow your progress and, of course, your writers. Chris Best, founder and CEO of Substack, thanks so much for taking the time. Okay, coming up, would you pay more to reduce your Uber rides' carbon footprint? We'll look at one of the new green initiatives hitting the ride-hailing app next. This is Bloomberg. Uber is joining the pandemic fight. The ride-hailing company is partnering with Moderna to provide vaccine information to riders and eventually even help schedule rides to appointments. The companies announced that they will help collaborate to help support the uptake of COVID-19 vaccines by sending in-app messages in the U.S. and expect to expand that program to more of Uber's 78 million users across the globe in coming months. And more news out of Uber. Would you like to, or would you, pay extra to know you are hailing a greener ride? That is what Uber is betting on as they roll out a myriad of initiatives aimed at achieving their goal of zero emissions by 2040. The company is launching Uber Green, an option to select a more environmentally friendly ride with the addition of a $1 surcharge. With me now, Uber's head of sustainability and environmental policy, Adam Gromis. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so if I pay $1 extra for my Uber, my green Uber, what does that mean?
Well, let me just set the context for why you would pay $1 more to get to lower emission rides on Uber, Emily. Where we're going is to build a fully zero emission multimodal platform by 2040, globally, everywhere we operate. We decided during the COVID pandemic that we need more of this clean air and these traffic-free streets and these lower emissions, but with the movement back. So we committed to being part of the solution for a green recovery. We have to build a better normal. So for us, it was about taking 4 key actions, of which Uber Green is the first one. We need to make more low-emission products available to riders in as many places as possible. So Uber Green is that first step. Second, it's empowering the drivers, because what we found is the key constraint is getting drivers affordable access to greener vehicles and more electric vehicles. And so supporting drivers with $800 million in resources over the next 5 years is a really critical component to the actions we're taking. The third part is it can't just be about Uber Green and electric vehicles. It has to be multimodal. EVs everywhere is still a lot of silent traffic, so we've doubled down on our partnerships with transit agencies and with micromobility operators. And the last component is transparency. I can't tell you where we're going unless I tell you where we are. So we released our first impact report last year to demonstrate where our emissions are today and how they're going to get to zero tomorrow. That's where we've started, and that's the context in which Uber Green sits.
So I'm sure you've done a lot of research on this. You know, how likely do you think consumers are and riders are to pay that extra dollar?
We're finding that consumers are. Again, back to the drivers. The drivers face substantial economic barriers to access not just hybrids, but certainly electric vehicles. And so where we've started in the U.S. and Canada is Uber Green is priced $1 more than UberX. But for just $1 more, you get a substantially lower emission ride in a hybrid or an EV, and the driver immediately gets 50 cents of that dollar. The other 50 cents goes into support the broader funds that other drivers can access to convert to EV. But it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, Emily. In Europe, where we see a different policy context, where governments have been more bullish on EVs, Uber Green is priced the same as UberX. And in fact, in a couple of key cities like London and Paris with particularly bullish policies, we have our clean air plans, which charge all riders a fee for every trip they take, almost like a carbon price. And that generates funds set aside for drivers who are converting to EV. So we're taking a portfolio approach to identify the best way to create a thriving marketplace that generates more clean and electric trips.
And Adam, we've got about a minute left. You are also adding more multimodal transportation features, more public transportation features, helping people use multiple forms of transportation, including Uber from point A to point B. But could that potentially undermine Uber?
Our riders are the kind of people that are looking for more options beyond the car they might own or don't own. And so our riders are also taking transit. Our riders are also looking for those micromobility options. As we think about the long-term goal of making car ownership not the primary option in cities, ride-sharing and on-demand solutions are complementary components along with public transportation and micromobility. And we're so excited to be expanding our offerings in public transportation today.
All right. Well, we'll catch up in 9 years with you at the very latest, Adam, as you work towards zero emissions by 2040. Adam Gromis, Uber Head of Sustainability and Environmental Policy. Thanks so much for joining us. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Bloomberg Daybreak Asia is coming up next. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.